and interprocedural. So this set of lectures covered global optimizations, and we started with something called as global constant propagation. So this was just constant propagation, but now at a global level. So the basic question that we wanted to ask was, how can we replace the use of variable x with any constant k? And the answer to this was that if every path that leads to x at this point uh, has been assigned x has been assigned the value k in its last assignment. Okay, so in order to answer this question, we came up with a technique called data flow analysis. Okay, so data flow analysis, we first started with data flow analysis values that assigned an abstract value to x at every program point. So these values were a constant c, any constant c, a value t or top that implied that this statement never executes, and a value bottom or an inverted t that that says that we are not sure basically that x is a constant or not. Okay, so now there are two things involved in this data flow analysis. First was finding these values at every point of the program, and second was using these values to do global constant propagation. So first of all, if we are given the values, how do we go about doing global constant propagation? So that is pretty easy. We just have to check that if at the entry point of a statement the value of x has been some constant c, then and that statement uses x, then we can replace that use of x with the constant c. Okay, so that was pretty easy. So the main question now lies into how to find these values. So for that, we came up with this set of rules basically that were some simple rules that transferred information from the top of a statement to its end using that statement. For example, if a statement assigns x a constant value c, so after that statement, the value of x will be that constant c. So there was some variety of these rules, and this led us to our basic fixed point iterative algorithm that worked as follows: that at every entry point, at every entry statement s, we set the value the c of x s comma x comma n to the value bottom. That is that we don't know that whether x is constant at this point, and all other c's were set to t. That is, the statement has not been executed. Then what we did iteratively was to pick up a statement S that violated the rules 1 to 8 and satisfied that statements by changing the value of C's. So then we saw some examples of this DFA values. And finally, in the last lecture, we talked about the arguments for convergence. Basically, that this algorithm always converges, and in order to do that, we defined a partial order on the values, and that was that bottom value is lesser than c, any constant c which is lesser than the top value. Okay, and we defined the notion of a greatest lower bound of any two values x and y, which was the greatest values that is lower or equal to both x and y. And the convergence argument then became that we just had to show that the values don't oscillate. So in order to show that, we just say that values start at t and they only decrease, because if we look at the set of rules, they always change the value from either t to c or c to bottom. Therefore, each value can at most change twice. So this gives us a bound on the number of iterations the algorithm can take. That is a number of program statements into 4, and this proves that the algorithm always converges. Finally, we had a small discussion on that this analysis was for only one variable. How to extend it for multi variables. Basically, that was pretty easy. We could do it for every variable differently, basically exclusively, or we can do all of this in one step, and that was helpful too, as we knew more values, more variables to be constant at some point, and that assigned constants earlier. Yeah, that's all.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rashov. Yeah, that's an excellent summary. So, okay, great. So Yeah, indeed. Basically, this is our introduction to data flow analysis. You will find that there are lots of lecture modules on data flow analysis. It goes all the way to, let's say, module number 100 something, right? 104 or something. So we're going to be discussing this a lot because it's such an important technique, it's such a powerful technique, and as we're going to look at both theoretical underpinnings and things like that. And it is a very successful technique. It's not just fundamental and everything. It's also a very successful technique. It's a not just in compiler optimization actually. So great. So let's I think that's a great summary. I don't have much to add here. Yeah, let's start with questions. Yeah, Jay.
Hi. In the module 75, when we were discussing global constant propagation, and then we somehow switched to global optimization tasks in general, we were talking about that proving. So optimization depends on knowing property X at a particular point, and in the module you said that proving X at point P requires the knowledge of the whole program. In my opinion, the whole program might be for property X. The requirement of the whole program might not be necessary. So I guess we can say may require uh, the the knowledge of the whole program, or is it necessary that we need the knowledge of the whole program every time?
No, yeah. So the point, I don't remember the exact phrasing of the sentence that I had on the module, but yes, it's not necessary that for every program point we require we require the knowledge of the whole program. It depends on the program. It depends on the program point. It depends on the property being checked. But yeah, there is a possibility that you require it for the whole program. Absolutely. Okay, I think Sonu.
Yes, sir. So I wanted to understand the high-level picture of these optimization things. So I think in the last lecture series, we discussed about local optimizations. And in this case, we discussed about global optimizations. So how does that actually work in practice? So is it like we do local optimizations in the basic blocks and then followed by global optimization, or are there two separate things? And overall, how does that look like in practice?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, that's a good question. How do local optimizations interact with global optimizations? Do we do local first or does it even matter? Okay, so here's the thing, right? Global optimizations subsume local optimizations, right? So if you're doing global constant propagation, then that subsumes local constant propagation. So you don't really need to do local constant propagation if you're already implementing global constant propagation, because that's take care of local constant propagation. So typically we don't talk about local optimizations separately. Typically we are usually doing global optimizations most of the time. But there are some local optimizations that are, in practice at the end of the program. So, most of the initial things are all global optimizations. You're kind of moving around things. You reserve local optimizations for things that are very specialized, that are very difficult to do globally, let's say, right? So peephole optimizations comes, is kind of jumping out at me all the time when I say specialized, when I say difficult to do globally. So peephole optimization, things like peephole optimizations are kind of very hard to do globally, right? I mean, it's much easier to do locally. And so those are the things that you would do. And so typically these kind of optimizations that are kind of tightening things within a basic block are kind of done at the end of the compilation pipeline.
I see.
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, you basically pick the big things first, and then
Yeah.
you pick the small things later, right? So maybe
Okay.
that's one way to think about it. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. Shubham?
Yeah. So in module 77, you mentioned a trivial solution to put bottom at every program point. but it would violate the sixth transfer function rule that says if we do not see a value top on the in of statement, we should assign a constant after that statement on the out of that statement.
I see. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So
That's
that should be, I think, top.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Thanks for pointing out that mistake. Can I request you to make a comment on that video related to that? Okay. So let me just repeat the question again and then also answer it. The question is that I mentioned in the lecture video that at every program point, if I just use the value bottom, then that is a trivial solution to the system of equations that I had earlier mentioned for this problem of constant propagation, global constant propagation. Now, I think Shubham is pointing out that bottom is not going to satisfy the relations between the in and out of a statement that is of the type x equals a constant, right? Let's say x equals 3. So if the statement is x equals 3, then the out of this statement should be x comma should be 3, not bottom, based on the equations, right? And so so Shubham is pointing out this this oversight, and indeed for this particular data flow analysis, everything bottom is not going to satisfy the solution, the answer. So yeah, that's very true. And yes, I need to be more careful here. Okay, so basically the point is that yeah, so I could yeah, so yeah, that's absolutely true. And
Everything top satisfies the solution, satisfies every rule.
no, everything top will not satisfy every rule, right? Because
We have the
we have the boundary condition as well, right? So the boundary, so as soon as we have the boundary condition, like everything top is not going to satisfy also. So boundary condition also needs to be satisfied, right? So so everything top is of course not an answer, but everything bottom is going to be an answer if I just change my system of equations slightly and kind of just start saying less than equal to instead of equal to. So say out of S is less than equal to 3, right? That's basically saying that, if I go across that statement, then I would either be 3 or I can be lower. And then, everything bottom becomes a feasible solution to this system of equations. Right. And yet, if I say, if I use my algorithm to my fixed point iteration algorithm, I should still get the best answer. Okay. So yeah, this is a subtle point. Thanks for pointing this out. I mean, I'm drawing these system of equations as equalities, but if I just kind of start drawing them as inequalities, then everything bottom will start satisfying. If they are drawn as equalities, then yeah, then I think we'll have to be a little more careful about saying what. Even then, there are multiple fixed points. So the point I was trying to make was that there are multiple fixed point solutions to the same program, and some are more precise than others, right? And that's all, right? And yeah, so I hope that point was clarified, right? But yeah, thanks for pointing this out. I would request you to pose the question, and also if if you agree with the answer, also post the answer, right? And that would be great, in my opinion. Yeah. So okay, great. Question, Anirudh?
So my doubt was with the seventh rule that we were told that if 5 does not apply, that is if C of the statement, the in of a statement is not T, then C of a statement that is X is assigned a function of something, like basically X is a constant. The statement is not X is a constant, comma X comma out is a bottom, right? So basically I wanted to I needed some clarification on what this F is like is it as simple as that all statements that are assigning X a variable, it is not a constant, must be using this rule, or is it something
Yeah.
else? Like, does the intermediate representation guarantee something here, or do local optimizations guarantee something? Like, is it like all statements that do not assign x a constant must be must be something that don't allow us to guarantee that x can be a constant or something?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah. So f basically is a placeholder for anything that is not a constant, right? So I mean, let's say x is equals y plus z, or x equals just ABC, whatever, right? So if it's not a constant, then we just are assuming that it is bottom.
And here, constant in constants we include expressions that can be evaluated at compile time. That expressions that are usually resolved at local optimization.
Okay, that's a great question. So do we? So let's say the statement is x equals y plus z. What if? So first of all, we are looking at the current snapshot of the program. So if we have already done local optimizations, and after local optimizations, y plus z has been replaced with 3, then it is a constant, right? I mean, so we are looking at the current snapshot of the program. The other question that you could have asked is that, what if I know that y and z are both constants? Let's say y equals 5 and z equals 7. Then is x equals y plus z? Should I say that the output of x equals y plus z is going to be 12? Equals 12, right? So we are not actually discussing that right now. For example, I mean, first of all, in these lectures, we are just doing one variable at a time, right? But if you are doing multiple variables in a time, then this would become a question. And we're going to discuss this question later on in the lecture modules.
Yes, I believe they took that point up in one of the modules in between something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yes, sir.
Okay, Jay.
Sir, I had a question regarding the ordering. So you talked about the ordering as a partial order, but in my opinion, partial order is also reflexive. So shouldn't it be a strict partial order, the less than sign?
So sorry, what's your question? I talk about a partial order.
So the ordering that you decide put out, the less than sign,
Okay.
the bottom less than constant less than a top, you talk that it is a partial order.
Right. I see.
But it's not reflexive, so it should be a strict partial order.
I see. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. So actually, I do in my modules talk about less than equal to.
So that is
in
a
that-
partial order. Yeah. So
in the-
that becomes a partial.
And then I also define somewhere a less than sign, which would be a strict partial order. Maybe I've not used that term, but which basically means that it is less than equal to but not equal to, right? Or in other words, A is less than B if A is less than equal to B and B is not less than equal to A. Right? Because if A is less than equal to B and B is less than equal to A, then A equals B. That's what we say here. No, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That's anti-symmetric property.
Yeah, that's anti-symmetric. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I guess are you picking on the terminology here that I should have
Yes,
on that particular slide called it a strict partial order? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for pointing that out. Can you make a comment on that particular module? And yeah, I think I'll
Yes, I'll do that.
Sure.
Yeah, I had one other question. So in the last module, when we are talking about how do we extend it to multiple variables, the timing analysis, we did the timing analysis and we talked that this is only for one variable that we're talking about. We also talked about that if we do it for multiple variables at one time, it becomes cheaper to update multiple values in one go. So I just wanted to let's have a discussion on the algorithms. I couldn't think of any particular way in which we could do that. So if someone has any idea on those,
sure. So by the way, can I request you to turn on your video if possible? I mean, I think you forgot to turn on your video, and just because.
No, my video is on actually. I guess it might not be shown, but I guess it's on from my side.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I don't see it. Okay, so yeah, that's a great question. So does anybody else want to answer that question? The question is, why would doing multiple variables in a single pass potentially be faster than doing every variable separately.
I think there would be a time versus space trade-off in the two cases. Like if you do multiple variables, then you would need to maintain some kind of table. Whereas if you do one variable at a time, it will be quadratic, but you'll be saving on space.
Yeah, yeah. And so if you maintain it as a table, then you can kind of potentially, for example, instead of actually, you can kind of do operations like you can do set operations, and you can have efficient data structures to maintain those sets, right? For example, you can have a binary search tree and get log n complexity to kind of do some of the operations and stuff like that. I do talk about the algorithm's manifestation when we actually do multiple variables in one go later on the modules. But here's a simple way of thinking about it. We can have a more efficient representation of the table, which Aditya says, or let's call it a set of the different variables. And that efficient representation would be easier to manipulate, right? So here's an example. For example, the one representation could be that if a variable is mapped to bottom, just don't have an entry for it in the table, right? So a missing entry is just like saying that it's bottom. Now that just reduces the size of the table and also reduces the time it takes to actually iterate over it and figure out what to do. And so you can do things faster, right? So, I mean, yeah, so, that's a high level answer. The details will be clearer when we actually look at that algorithm and how we are doing it, and to see an example of why it will become faster. But I mean, in general, right, it can never be slower, first of all. It's just that, there's an opportunity to be faster because now you have this kind of table that you're maintaining, and now you have flexibility on how you maintain this table. Which these kind of flexibilities were just absent when you do every variable separately. Great. Yes, Sonu?
Yes, sir. So I have a question about this global constant propagation that we talked about. So that is like one type of global optimization, but similar things can be done for other local optimizations as well? Or is it something very specific that we discussed in detail?
No, no, no. The whole point of doing data flow analysis is that we want to kind of generalize most, if not all, of the optimizations that we have discussed so far as local optimization. And so the next, 15, 20 odd modules are just about generalizing data flow analysis to other analyses as well, including things like constant propagation, common sub-expression elimination, dead code elimination, copy propagation, and everything that we have discussed so far, right? Strength reduction, things like that. We can do all that in global as well. Yeah.
Okay. And I had a related question to the partial order thing that was asked right now. So we talk about this greatest lower bound, which and that operator is reflexive and transitive is what is discussed. So in that case, I mean, there was example that if you want to find GLB of 1 and 2, it will be bottom because we cannot compare constants. But if it is GLB of 1 comma 1, so that will be 1, right? So it is reflexive in that sense.
It is reflexive. That's why it's less than equal to, right? Yeah.
Okay.
I think he was just pointing out that in a particular slide I had less than, and so there I was saying it's a partial order. I should have said it's a
Oh, okay. Got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Vijay? Vijay, do you want to? We cannot hear you. Vijay, are you on mute or I cannot hear you? Issue with mic, I see. Okay. All right. Yeah, Indrajit.
Yes, sir. So I was thinking if we can actually extend the idea of values to include more subsets. I think someone else is speaking.
Sorry, can you? Sorry, I couldn't catch the full question. Can you repeat the question?
I thought someone else was actually speaking. Anyway, yeah, I don't think, I think that was just not. Anyway, yeah. So what I'm saying is that instead of just having three values, that is constant, top, and under, if you can actually include some kind of subset. So for example, in C and C++, we often have some kind of integer and we have if that integer, right? So in that case, we don't need to know that if that integer is exactly equal to 5 or 6 or like that, right? We only need to know if it is exactly 0 or it is not 0, right? So in that case, we can actually include two more values, that is it is exactly equal to 0 and it is not equal to 0, right? And then we can actually add that into the analysis. I hope we can do that. So I'm just asking that if we can actually do that in this case of analysis.
That's a very relevant question, and I'm glad that you're asking that question. So, would somebody like to answer that question? So let me repeat the question just in case you didn't catch the question. So the question is that in this constant propagation analysis, we are basically determining whether x is a constant c for some range of c's, let's say, whatever, integers or whatever, whether x is a given constant, some constant c among this set of constants at any program point. So that's the current analysis. But let's say x was not a constant at a particular program point, but it was possible to figure out that, hey, x is not equal to 0, or let's say x is greater than 0. Right? So at a certain program point, it's possible to figure out that x is definitely greater than 0, but it's not possible to say that's a constant. Now, how will you first, I guess the first question is it possible to extend this analysis so that just doesn't capture the information that x is a constant at a particular program point, but it's also able to disambiguate those points where x is definitely greater than 0, positive, and from those points where I can't be sure whether it's positive or negative, right? So it could, or 0, right? So is it possible to change this analysis or extend this analysis so that I'm able to identify this information at every program point in the program, that x is definitely greater than 0, or I cannot say. All right. So what do you think? Yeah. Yeah. Who's speaking?
Vijay.
Vijay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. If we can like predict at every step or some steps where x is appearing, that like we are sure about its value, then basically what we are saying that we know all the variables that were involved in the computation with x, and it's like solving the equations, and then we are sure about the value of x. But if we, if all the constants are involved, then you are restricting your program. So like it's not possible for every kind of program, but for some kind of program.
Okay. So you're saying that it's not possible to identify whether x is greater than 0. By the way, when I say possible to identify if x is greater than 0, I'm saying it's in an over approximate way, right? Just like we are doing for constant. So in some cases, we should be definitely able to say that, yeah, oh, here I'm sure x is greater than 0. And some other places we'll conservatively say, oh, I can't say, bottom, right? So, I guess, maybe Vijay was basically saying that, look, we just like for constant propagation, even for constant propagation, right? It's not possible to say to find all the constants. We just make a best effort at finding the constants, and then for some places where maybe it could have been constant, but we just say I don't know, right? That's a safe answer. So we are doing that in the constant propagation, and the same would hold even for this positivity analysis, x is greater than 0 analysis, right? So yeah, that's true. But still, I would say that it's possible to implement the x is greater than 0 analysis, just like constant propagation. And the question is how. All right. So let's go to Aditya.
If we're allowed to do constant folding while doing the analysis, then figuring out whether x is positive or not can be done. We just need to come up with an analogous set of rules for how x would be modified when it passes through a statement. Like if we know the constant value of x, then that is best. If we cannot do that, then we'll be getting something like y minus x or something. And if we can do constant folding and figure out if z is greater than y, then or z minus y is greater than 0, something like that, then we can come up with an analogous set of rules for figuring out this positivity.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks, Aditya. Anirudh, do you want to say something about this, or is that a different question?
So like I was thinking of a method where I was thinking of an answer of the question you said. So like I'm just spitballing here. Basically, the condition that you said that we can check if x is greater than 0 or x is greater than something at some points without actually determining if x is a constant. So like I was thinking that this would probably be useful in places where the Boolean value. So for example, if there is some statement that depends on x greater than 5, for example, that could be optimized by just eliminating some program paths that only run when x is not greater than 5. So like I was thinking we could treat x greater than 5 as a Boolean variable and just do constant propagation on that.
Okay. Treat x is greater than 5 as a Boolean variable and then do constant propagation on that. Okay, that's a reasonable way of thinking about it. But yeah, I mean, I guess it just doesn't really matter how you treat, whether you are interested in whether you actually check for x is greater than 5 or you just check for Booleanness, the Boolean value true for x is greater than 5. I think the challenge doesn't change. I mean, it's not making the problem any simpler by doing the latter. And I'm going to discuss that in a moment.
Right. So maybe we need to add additional rules to the transfer function to.
Exactly. I mean, it's all about figuring out what the rules of the transfer function are going to be. And I guess Aditya was also saying the same thing. Yeah. Arpit?
So what I wanted to say was that just keeping a track of whether it is greater than 0 or not at every program point won't be like very useful because of the existence of an overflow. Because if we have some statement that x equals x plus 1, then even if we know that x was positive before that, then we can't say that it would be positive after that. So what would be helpful is that we could maintain a set of potential values that x could take, and then we could be sure that either x takes these values or we don't know that it value it takes, so that can be a bottom value.
Okay, excellent. So I guess you're pointing out that x is greater than 0 is not going to be, I think you didn't, so you started with saying that x is greater than 0 is not going to be that useful. But I think what you wanted to say was that x is greater than 0 is not going to be that helpful. Or maybe you meant, maybe both the words were basically similar, but basically you're saying that, look, if I have x equals x plus 1, even though at the in point of the statement, I know that x is greater than 0. At the out point, I can't even say that x is greater than 0. Okay. All right, that's a very interesting observation, because in a real programming language, of course, there are some idealistic programming languages where x is an integer, a mathematical integer. It's infinite. It's sort of so to say, like it has infinite space, although no computer is infinite. We haven't been able to develop a computer which has infinite. I don't think it's even possible. But they kind of give you the abstraction. It's just so large that no humanly possible number can be. But x equals x plus, but for languages like C, Java, Python, whatever, right? The language that we use in everyday world, x equals x plus 1 can overflow. If it overflows, then it can wrap around. So if it's the maximum value, then I do plus 1, then it becomes the minimum value. Or if it's an unsigned, then it becomes 0 or something like that, right? So those kind of things happen, and so x is greater than. So I can't even say, so if x equals x plus 1, that at the in point I have x greater than 0, then at the out point I'll have to just say bottom, because I don't know whether x is actually the maximum value or not. And so the solution that Arpit is suggesting is that instead of just capturing the fact that x is greater than 0, let's try to capture what are the set of values that x could have at this program point. All right, so maybe it can, so maybe it can be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's the set of values that x can have. And let's capture that. And then if I capture that, then if I see x equals x plus 1, then at the out point, I would say, oh, it's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, right? And so, that's how I'll define my transfer functions, and things would start working. Okay, so that's a good point. So first of all, yeah, even if I guess the point is well taken that if I have x is greater than 0, then you have x equals x plus 1. Then on the out point, we may not be able to say x is greater than 0 because of overflow semantics. And so even if you do this analysis for most programs, you may not be able to actually identify that x is actually greater than 0. Now, I want to point out here one thing, that a language like C, for example, calls integer overflow, signed integer overflow, as undefined behavior. So if you do x equals x plus 1 in C, then you can be sure that if x was greater than 0 in the beginning of the program, or beginning of the statement, at the in of the statement, then it is also greater than 0 at the out of the statement. So it is also tied to the language semantics. Okay, x equals x plus 1 is undefined behavior. We haven't discussed undefined behavior in this course yet. We're probably going to do that later in the course. But you may want, if you are interested, you may want to you may want to search for this string, signed integer overflow in C is undefined behavior, right? So you'll be able to learn more about this. The other point, the other kind of idea that is coming out is that why don't we just maintain a list of values, right? And say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like just the thing that I was saying. And that seems like the most precise thing you could do, right? That would subsume constant propagation, because something is a constant if that set is a singleton set, right? Something is top if that set is an empty set. Something can have 2 values, something can have 5 values, whether it's greater than 0, it's all apparent from the set of values. And so let's try to understand how this analysis is going to work. So let's say I have a loop which says for I equals 0 to 10, I plus plus, and let's say it's not doing anything. Then DFA, when it comes in, it's going to say, and initially I is 0. So let's look at the loop body and then say, okay, at the first time it comes in, it's going to say, oh, I equals 0. So I is just a singleton set. Then we're going to go around the loop, and then we're going to meet. And on one edge of the loop, I'm going to get I plus 1, which earlier it was 0, so now it becomes 1, right? And so I'm going to meet with 0 and 1. And what's the new value? A set of 2 elements, 0, 1. Now I do this again, and I get another value 2. And now I'm going to get a set of 2 values, 0, 1, 2. Then I meet it again. I'm going to get a set of 4 values, 0, 1, 2, 3, 3, and so on, right? And actually this can go on forever, right? If it was for I equals 0 to n, then I can keep going on. So it's very clear that this set has to have a bounded size. I mean, it cannot have an unbounded size, because the set has unbounded size. My DFA iteration algorithm would just keep going on forever. And so it's very important that there is a bounded size. And we're going to talk about what this means for a DFA in a more formal theoretical way later on, right? So this formulation of the DFA seems like a very good thing to have. Like, let's have a set of all the values that x could take at every program point. That's going to subsume constant propagation. That's going to subsume Indrajit's idea, everything. But it's just, that DFA may not converge, and that's a big problem, right? Or it may have a very long running time. So we need to have a bounded set. So yeah, I mean, it's possible to extend this analysis to say, okay, I'm going to keep track of at most 2 values, and if I see more than 2 values, then I'm going to just use bottom. So now I have, instead of just 3 values in constant propagation, top, C, and bottom, now I have top, C, D, and bottom. And not just that, sorry, top, C, and I should say C1, C2, D2, and bottom. So either I have a singleton set value, or I have a double set value, or I just raise my hand and say, I don't know anything. That's the bottom value, right? So yeah, it's possible to extend this analysis in these ways. To answer Andrajit's original question, yes, of course, it's possible to also extend it in the way that, so instead of saying that, okay, let's create a set of all values which are greater than 0, but that's going to be unbounded, so we don't want to do that. So that let's just say, let's just keep a Boolean predicate saying x is greater than 0. So then my lattice is going to be top, true, and bottom, right, or something like that, or maybe just false and true, right? That's going to even that's fine. We're going to get more experience with how to design our lattice and so on, kind of doing this. But this is one way of doing it. Just kind of as was mentioned earlier, that just treat x is greater than 0 as a Boolean variable and just say whether it's a constant true or not, and then just have the same lattice top, constant true, and bottom, right? Okay, and so that would work. Just the challenge here is to define the transfer functions. So what would transfer functions look like? You could say, oh, if it's a branch, and if the branch is actually checking x is greater than 0, then on the right side of the branch, I can be sure that x is greater than 0 is true. On the left-hand side of the branch, I will just say not a bottom. If there's some other kind of branch, then it's going to just, whatever is the incoming value is going to go out. If I'm updating x using +1, and if it's C, then whatever, if the in is true, then out is also true. If it is x equals x minus 1, then if the in is true, then the out is bottom, because I don't know whether it could, it could actually go less than 0 or equal to 0. So yeah, that's how you would design a data flow analysis. And we are going to look at lots of examples, right? So yeah, this will become very, you'll get a lot of practice with this. Okay, I think we are kind of, Anirudh, let's try to kind of make the discussion a little faster. I think I'm going too slow. Anirudh?
Sorry, my hand was raised.
Okay, Jay?
Yeah, I just had one comment on the thing. So we were talking about maintaining a set, and let's say if we have x is equal to x plus 1. So initially x has value 1, 2, 3 up till 10, and then we do x is equal to x plus 1, and we have, so you said 2, 3 up till 11. So won't be the problem of overflow come over here as well? Like how can we somehow say that maybe 11 is an overflow?
Yeah, so if it is an overflow, if it is possible in your language to overflow, then if let's say 7 was the largest number, I mean just using power of 2, right? So if let's say 7 was the largest number, and you say +1, then, and let's say my initial set was 6, 7. Then if you say +1, then based on the semantics of +1, I'm going to say, oh, the new set is going to be 7, 0. Right? So that's just going to be the wraparound value, and that's it. Okay,
so then for this type of analysis, we need to know the architecture or the semantics, whatever the language would
For
require.
every type of analysis, you need to know the underlying machine. All right, even for constant propagation, because you are
we have so in the first module that we're discussing, we had this concept of intermediate language, right? And then when we were converting languages to intermediate,
I think I understand your question. So that's a great question. Thanks for that question. And the question is, once I convert it to intermediate language, won't I lose all this information that x equals x plus 1 cannot overflow or can overflow or whatever, right? Or if it overflows, then how much it overflows. And so if I lose that information, then what happens at the intermediate representation? So for example, if I'm using LLVM IR, I've just forgotten that it was a C program or a Java program or whatever, right? And then if I see x equals x plus 1 in the LLVM, then what should I do? So the answer to that is that you need to be conservative. Okay, so the conservative answer is that, if you see x equals x plus 1, you conservatively assume that it may overflow. Or you can just say that I don't know what it'll do, in which case I'll just say bottom. Right? Maybe it will overflow to 0, maybe it will overflow to some other value, I don't know, right? And so I'm just going to say bottom, and that's the safe thing to do. What is done in practice is that LLVM actually preserves some of this information. So it actually preserves this information that it was a signed integer. So there's a, if you're interested, you should search for this keyword called no signed overflow in LLVM, right? So there are two types of add in LLVM: add, normal add, and no signed overflow add, right? And so if you're going across the no signed overflow add, then you can make some assumptions. If you're going through a regular add, then you can make some other assumptions. Also, what the size of LLVM encodes the size of the bit vector of the integer. It's not like when I say something is an integer, I know the size, right? So that's going to help out.
Great. The flags are NSW and UW and exact, sir.
Right, NSW, yeah, NSW and UW and exact. Yeah, thanks, Aditya. Okay, more questions?
I think there's a question in the chat. I also have the same question. How is the data flow technique applied in case of multi-threaded programs or in case of pointers?
Okay, so I'm going to answer. So these are two very different questions. How does data flow analysis apply in case of multi-threaded programs? So in all the discussion I've done so far in the course, and for a long time I'm going to do, maybe I'm going to cover multi-threaded at the very end or something. I'm just assuming here that the program doesn't have data races, all right? And that's actually an assumption that C also makes, Java also makes, right? So these languages are support like data races. For example, data races in C are undefined behavior. That's what allows the compiler to do all the optimization. If data races are possible, then I won't be able to do constant propagation. Okay. So I'm making this assumption that's a sequential programming model. When I say it's a sequential programming model, it doesn't mean that there are not multiple threads. There could be multiple threads, but if one processor is in a particular program region, then we make the assumption that, and it is accessing a certain region of memory, then another thread cannot also simultaneously access the same region of memory such that one of them is a write. That's called a data race, right? And this property of a programming language that there cannot be a data race, or if there is a data race, then it's undefined behavior, is called the property of data race freedom. Okay, and C basically requires data race freedom. So if your program, if you create two threads and both threads are trying to write to the same location without doing any kind of synchronization like locks or something like that, then your program is illegal because it has undefined behavior. Okay, and the reason it's illegal, the reason the C designers chose to make such programs illegal is so that the compiler writers can have a free hand in doing the optimization. Okay. Okay, great, nice question. And the second question is, in the presence of pointers, now nothing changes. I mean, so pointers, pointer analysis is also modeled as a data flow analysis. Aliasing analysis is also modeled as a data flow analysis. Aliasing analysis whether two pointers can point to the same location or not, right? So these kind of things can also be done using data flow analysis, and we'll get some practice with DFA as we go along. I hope that answers your question, Vijay, or?
Yes, sir, it answers. Thank you.
Thanks. Aditya?
If C assumes that data races are undefined behavior, then does the compiler fail silently, or does it throw up a diagnostic?
It fails silently. It fails silently.
Okay.
That's a typical behavior. I mean, of course, you can do whatever you like. So there would be some runtimes which would actually detect such data races and kind of warn the programmer about it. But doing so is very expensive, right? And so you won't do that in production code or something like that. Maybe for testing frameworks and stuff, you would detect such undefined behavior and flag it for the user. But typically they fail silently. Okay, I think this has been a very good discussion. Are there more questions? I mean, we still have a couple of minutes left, and just in case you have any doubts, something we can, or some questions, open-ended questions, I'm happy to address them. Otherwise, we'll just call it a day.
So since data races are like common parallel programming bugs, why have they classified it as undefined behavior? Like these bugs are difficult to catch.
Why have they classified as undefined behavior?
To throw up a diagnostic at least.
Does somebody else want to answer that question? I mean, just in case you have been able to follow this discussion. By the way, this discussion is not part of our lecture discussion, right? So, I mean, it's okay if you haven't followed it. I would encourage you to, this is recorded session, so you can kind of revisit it, search on the net, learn more about it, ask questions, the course staff. But anybody wants to answer this question? If data races are undefined behavior, then why do language designers choose to fail silently rather than flagging it for users, because they're such difficult bugs to catch? Because to catch these bugs at runtime is a very expensive proposition. And typically people, when you write your multi-threaded program, you would more rather prefer that your program is fast than kind of make it really, just checking everything. And it's super hard to check this actually, right? So you're making it super slow. And so just for the whole idea of doing undefined behavior is so that, you don't have to worry about these corner cases and just kind of go ahead with the optimization. And that's the point. And actually, I would say this can be thought of as a tension between compiler guys and operating system people. So compiler guys just love undefined behavior, right? Because it just gives them more freedom. Operating system guys, or in general people who are doing parallel programming, especially operating system, because operating system has a lot of internal kind of very subtle things. They just hate this kind of non-deterministic semantics of the language. In fact, this can be seen. I mean, I would encourage you to search for, this thing. So no signed overflow, right? No signed integer overflow, NSW, as we were discussing in LLVM. This is something that Linus Torvalds has decided to completely ignore. So if so in other words, Linux is not written in C. Linux is written in a dialect of C, which does not assume no signed overflow, right? And so Linux can be compiled. To compile Linux, you must give GCC a flag which says no signed overflow, right? Something like that. So basically, you don't allow the compiler to assume that x equals x plus 1 cannot overflow, all right? Because if the compiler makes that optimization, then your Linux code can go bad. And so if you search on the net, you'll find lots of conflicts, flame wars on email, and the people calling each other names, like, this doesn't make sense, and the other guy saying, you guys don't understand, and stuff like that, right? So it's a very interesting read, in my opinion. All right, we are over time, so thank you, and I'm going to let's start viewing the lectures starting from lecture module 81 till maybe 85 or something. I'm going to post that on the team in any case. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Sir?
Yes.
I just one suggestion that we also have a next class. Some of us have a next class at 9, so maybe if we can end by 8:55 or something.
Sure, absolutely. That makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.